Hi, everybody. This is theoretical bullshit. Wow, that took a lot longer than I thought. I guess I owe you an explanation, but I'm not going to give you one because I have a lot of material to cover, and not a lot of time to cover it. So I'm here. I'm in New York City, living my new life in my new apartment, working my new job, and I finally have all my equipment back. So I'm ready to go. One of the first videos I wanted to make was a response to Veritas and Noah. Just before turning on the camera, I watched your most recent video, and uh, I'm so sad. I'm so sad to see you go. I think that's a tragedy because you are, in my opinion, one of the great thinkers on YouTube, regardless of your position. I've always enjoyed your videos, and I've consistently been looking for an excuse to start up an ongoing exchange with you, and now it's too late. And you know what? To some degree, I'm angry that the atheist community, of which I'm supposedly a part, can't handle civil discourse without apparently throwing in an ad hominem or speculating about what's wrong with you neurologically in order to get their point across. That's embarrassing for me. That embarrasses me, and I'm sorry. But even though I know you're probably not going to be around to respond, you asked me a question, and I wanted to give you the best answer I could. The question was about God's necessity versus God's supposed randomness. You wanted to know if God is a necessary being, and if we agree on that, then how does it follow that God is random? And you use the word arbitrary and random interchangeably, by the way, and they're a little bit different. The word arbitrary is usually more applicable within the realm of conscious choices and decision making, whereas randomness is more about probability of occurrence and whether conscious decision making is even a factor. It's a fuzzy line, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to assume that when you use the word arbitrary, you intend it to be synonymous with random. Here's what you said. You said, I don't see how God's essential properties are arbitrary simply because they could not have been otherwise. Isn't the fact that they could not have been otherwise what makes them necessary and therefore not arbitrary? And the answer is yes, but I wasn't arguing that. I wasn't arguing that God's properties would be arbitrary because they could not have been otherwise. I was arguing that they would be arbitrary because they very well could have been otherwise. If you believe God and his qualities never came into existence at any point, and they just happen to be what they are for no reason with no cause, then there's nothing about existence that prevents them from having been otherwise, and nothing about existence that requires them to be what they are. So the idea that God would be a necessary being and his particular qualities necessary qualities is not a premise that we both agree on. In fact, it's an assumption that I strongly dispute. So let me elaborate on that. When we call something necessary, we're saying it's a need, it's needed, it's a necessity. To say that something is true necessarily is to say that it needs to be true. I think that the definition that you're using for the word necessary when you talk about God is slightly different and slightly removed from what necessary means in any other context. And here's why. In life, the whole need-necessity concept is conditional. Always. It's contingent upon something else. It's not absolute. You take any applicable example you want and you'll see what I mean. An engine is a necessary part of my car, but it's not a necessary part of my car, period. It's a necessary part of my car if my car must be driven. The engine has to be necessitated by something. That's how it gets to be necessary. So the proposition, my car must be driven, is the condition which makes the engine a necessity. In other words, something is only necessarily true because something else is true that necessitates it. To say that something is needed is to say that there is something else doing the needing. But when you say that God is a necessary being, or that God's particular qualities are necessary, you seem to mean some kind of unconditional necessity. The way you put it was God's qualities are necessary because they could not have been anything other than what they are. But let's say I'm in Vegas and I'm playing craps. I don't actually play craps. I have no idea if this is a good analogy or not. But let's say it's necessary for me to roll a 7. Now, the fact that rolling a 7 is necessary is not antithetical to the fact that rolling a 7 happens randomly. In other words, if I did roll a 7, the fact that it was necessary for me to do so does not mean that it couldn't have been otherwise. It very well could have been otherwise. It just couldn't have been otherwise on the specific condition that I was going to win my bet. And likewise, God could randomly have a certain quality which would be a quality that is necessary for X, Y, and Z to be true. But it doesn't follow from this that it would have been impossible for God not to have that quality just because that quality was necessary for X, Y, and Z to be true. If God didn't have that quality, X, Y, and Z wouldn't be true. Whoever said that X, Y, and Z had to be true? So I don't think this is the way you're defining God's necessity. Otherwise, you wouldn't have found God's necessity to be problematic for God's randomness. Unlike the rolling of the dice, you don't mean necessary for this to be true or necessary for that to happen. You mean necessary, period. Which I have to tell you seems divorced from its meaning to me. I don't know what that means. But what I can do is I can try to address the couldn't have been otherwise thing. I'm almost positive that what you believe is that God's existence and the properties of God's existence couldn't have been otherwise. Not couldn't have been otherwise in order for this to be true or that to be true, just couldn't have been otherwise, period. End of story. That's it. And again, it's a tragedy that you're not going to be around anymore, because I would really like to know what your reasoning for that is. Because to me, it seems not only unsubstantiated, but counterintuitive. If your reasoning is that the conclusion God couldn't have been otherwise is what logically follows from God's existence and qualities just happen to be what they are for no reason with no cause, then I think you have it exactly backwards. You believe God is loving, for example. So, the default state for all existence is that there is this being, and this being happens to be loving. This being never became loving, nothing caused this being to be loving, this being just is and just always has been loving. Does anything about that mean that this being couldn't have always been hateful or indifferent instead? No. You can't say that this being is loving rather than hateful for a reason, and I went over this in Lord Logic a little bit. Because a reason necessitates the existence of a consciousness independent of this being, capable of causing it to be loving and having a reason for doing so, but you don't believe that. You can't credit this being for its own lovingness. If its qualities are as changeless as its existence, which you believe they are, then this being cannot have existed prior to its qualities and thus cannot have caused or influenced its qualities. Having the property of lovingness is just something that this being would have no control over. You can't say that this being is loving because it's better than being hateful or indifferent. Better for what? Better according to whom? Better is a subjective term, and by the way, requires the existence of a subject, which wouldn't exist outside of God. And even then, there's nothing about existence that would require this being to have the better set of qualities. So as a Christian, your beliefs about God force you to conclude that God is loving for no reason. He just happens to be. And the same goes for every aspect of God's nature and God's qualities. God's nature is what it is for no reason. He just happens to have that nature and not another one. Same for God's existence. If God indeed exists, he exists for no reason. He just happens to. And by the way, as a side note, it also follows that God's existence and qualities are purposeless, since you deny the existence of any agency capable of assigning God and his qualities a purpose, or creating God and his qualities for a purpose. What this means is the probability or the likelihood that reality happened to entail a God existing is equal to the likelihood that reality had entailed no God existing. This is true because, as I just demonstrated, there could exist no state of affairs which would make one more likely than the other. And likewise, the likelihood that this God always had one set of qualities is equal to the likelihood that this God always had a different set of qualities. This is what makes God's existence, as well as God's properties, random. In fact, on a technical level, this is exactly what random means. Merriam-Webster defines random as being or relating to a set or to an element of a set, each of whose elements has equal probability of occurrence. And even the second definition provided by Merriam-Webster also applies to the Christian God. Made, done, happening, or chosen without method or conscious decision. And this fits perfectly. You deny the existence of any method or conscious decision accountable for God existing instead of not, or having one set of qualities instead of another. So, yeah, that's my argument for why the existence and qualities of the Christian God would not only be unnecessary in the sense that you're using the word, but random. But clearly, the only reason you believe what you do is because you're delusional and you have a brain disease. Again, I'm so sad to see you go, and I wish your family the best, and I hope that something calls you back to YouTube quicker than you predict.